Welcome to Second Nature, a collaborative podcast produced by the organizers and host venues for the exhibition Second Nature, Photography in the Age of the Anthropocene. I'm Marshall Price, Chief Curator, and Nancy A. Nasher and David J. Hemaseger, Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Nasher Museum of Art at Duke University, and one of the curators of the exhibition. I'm joined by my co-curator, Jessica May.
Hi, Marshall. I'm Jessica May. I'm the Executive Director of the Cantor Museum of Art in Kansas City, Missouri. Our exhibition presents the first major photographic survey examining the Anthropocene thesis through the lens of global contemporary photography. The Anthropocene is generally defined as a proposed geological epoch in which humanity has had an impact on the global climate. Over the course of this project, however, we've come to understand the Anthropocene not as one singular narrative, but a diverse and complex web of relationships between and among humanity, industry, and ecology, the depths of which are continually being discovered.
We conceived of this podcast as a way to broaden our audience for those who may not be able to see the exhibition, as well as provide a forum in which we can continue to discuss topics relevant to art and the Anthropocene in broadly intersectional and interdisciplinary ways. As Second Nature makes its way across North America, the Nasher Museum and the Kemper Museum of Contemporary Art, along with our host partners, the Cantor Art Center at Stanford and the Anchorage Museum, Alaska, will release episodes that include discussions with artists, curators, scholars, scientists, and others who engage with aspects of the Anthropocene in their work.
We hope you enjoy the podcast, and for more information on the exhibition at its initial venue, please visit nasher.duke.edu. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tanvi Dutta Gupta, and today I'm honored to be facilitating a conversation between the artist Meghann Riepenhoff and Professor of Applied Physics Hideo Mabuchi. Born in Atlanta, Georgia, Meghann Riepenhoff is an artist based on the west coast of the United States. She received a BFA in photography from the University of Georgia and an MFA from San Francisco Art Institute. Her exhibitions include the High Museum of Art, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Denver Art Museum, the Portland Museum of Art, Crystal Bridges Museum of Art, the Nasher Museum, the New York Public Library, CO Berlin, and the Aperture Foundation, among others. Publications include Art Forum, the New York Times, Time Magazine Lightbox, The Guardian, Foam, Oprah Magazine, Harper's Magazine, and Wired Magazine. Collections include the High Museum of Art, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Museum of Contemporary Photography, Harvard Art Museum, Amon Carter Museum of American Art, and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Riepenhoff published 2 monographs, Literal Drift plus Ecotone, and Ice with Radius Books and Yossi Milo Gallery. She was an artist in residence at the Banff Center for the Arts and the John Michael Kohler Center for the Arts, was an affiliate at the Headland Center for the Arts, and is a Guggenheim Fellow. A physicist by training, Hideo explores a nexus of conventional scientific research, craft as a dedicated ceramicist and occasional weaver, applied philosophy, and integrative education. Hideo teaches and directs a research laboratory at Stanford University as a professor of applied physics. His group-sponsored research focuses mainly on quantum physics and physics of computation. His personal research further extends to the science of traditional craft materials and processes. Hideo teaches undergraduate courses that center craft and student making, bridging STEM fields with the arts and humanities. He currently serves as Denning Family Director of the Stanford Arts Institute and as Chair of Stanford's Breadth Governance Board. Meghann and Hideo are both incredible creative people, and I'm so excited for all of us to learn from them over the next hour as they explore science, art, and their intersections in the Anthropocene. My first question for both of you comes just from the exhibition. What does the Anthropocene and living in the Anthropocene mean to you? Meghann, why don't you go first?
Yeah, well, I'm so happy to be here and to connect with Hideo, and thank you, Tanvi, and the audience for joining us. It's a big question. We're living in a tenuous moment where humans have become the primary carvers of the planet. It used to be that water was the primary shaper of the earth, and we have usurped that sort of natural force in our role, and with our interventions. For me, living in this moment is really an opportunity to look at this very complex relationship that humans have with our environment. I see it as very complicated. It's full of beauty and pain and joy and despair and political moves that shape our future and activists. And it's a rich, complicated problem in which we find ourselves as humans when we consider what will we do with these huge marks that we are leaving? What kind of marks will we make?
Hideo, what about you?
So yeah, it's so great to be in conversation with the both of you, and thanks everybody for tuning in. Um, the Anthropocene, I guess I generally think of it as this is kind of the stage in the development of human civilization and technology where we're starting to exhaust the planet, and so living in this time or responding to the realization that this is happening, I have to think that it largely means that we need to change our idea of what progress is. We've gotten so used to this mindset in which progress kind of means bigger, better, more, faster, cheaper. But obviously, we have to let go of that, and that often goes under the general idea of sustainability. But clearly, we have to replace that older idea of progress with something else which is equally compelling. And it's one thing to just say those as words, but it's a completely different thing to try to get people to really buy into that, or to even have any sort of consensus about what's really the direction that we need to shift towards. So as Meghann was just saying, that's a very complicated sort of calculus that involves policy and culture and all kinds of nebulous things like that. So it's really it's a challenging moment for all of us.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, how do both of you see the role of art and culture in tackling complex concepts like the Anthropocene or other scientific ideas? I've heard from many people that art and science are often experienced as very siloed projects, but for both of you, they form core parts of your work.
Hideo, you want to jump in first?
I'll give it a shot.
Okay.
I think art and science are both generally ways of responding to wonder, responding to curiosity, and sometimes ways of responding to disturbance. When something disturbs you, how do you respond to that? How do you feel like you have some agency in trying to make things better? And when it comes to the Anthropocene and the impact that humans are having on the planet, I think there are some people who can read or hear about statistics and really feel those as a strong call to action, have some visceral sense of what numbers mean. But that's not true for everybody. I think there's a huge challenge in trying to make empirical data or even, people's personal observations about how things are changing, how to make everybody feel like that's something that's relevant to them. And I don't think there's any science of that, right? I think as many different approaches are required as many different kinds of people we have in our communities. And so, there's definitely a kind of collaborative role that art and science need to play in rising to the occasion.
Absolutely. Yeah. And building on that and echoing some of your sentiments, I think about the possibility for showing imagined futures or for showing new uses of materials or generally for opening up the ideas of possibility. We think that this is the one way that we can move through our existence, but actually there's nuanced ways that may be subtle shifts. There are ways that have massive shifts, and I think art can point to those possibilities. In my own practice, when I first started working with cyanotype nearly 15 years ago, one of the things that intrigued me was, could I make images with this material in a way that I hadn't seen the material used before? And I think that inquiry, that question gives us the opportunity to look at things in ways we haven't seen them before, and to know that the future is not laid out. We have chance and choice and opportunities and ways to navigate what is to come. And that sort of visual connection can help us dream, like, what are the possibilities here?
So speaking of material, Meghann, you have a work in Second Nature from your Waters of America series. Could you tell us a little bit about the process of making that work and how that work fits into that series?
Yeah, absolutely. And Tanvi, if it's cool with you, I'll speak to both of the pieces in the show because
Yeah.
like sister series.
Yeah.
So yeah, Waters of the Americas is a series that I began during our 45th presidential administration in response to a 2017 executive order requiring the EPA to review Waters of the United States rule, which protects a lot of our waters. And so I had been working in relationship and in collaboration with environments for many years at this point, but I felt this call to respond to what we were doing on a federal level in terms of our relationship with the environment and to focus my collaborations on environments that were impacted by human interventions. So we're talking about places that have been impacted by industry, places where we're seeing an increase rate of rain or other climate activity, places that humans have generally impacted and typically caused a kind of damage in them. So the piece that is in the show is called Waters of the Americas, World's End to the Mouth of the Mashpee River, Deluge from Residual Hurricane Ian Storms, Waves, Hingham to Cape Cod, and it was made in 2022. It's a unique dynamic cyanotype. So what happened is the curators of the exhibition asked me if I could work in a landscape that I found compelling in this Waters of the Americas thread. And I went to World's End. I loved the name of it. I love this idea that there is a beach called World's End. And I loved sort of knowing the complicated history of what has happened along the shoreline of Massachusetts. There's a long history there of people impacting it in a variety of ways. So I took my materials there, and as it happened, I found myself there in the middle of just the ending of Hurricane Ian. So I showed up to print, and the water was coming down so hard, the rain was so hard that we couldn't like get out of the car with the paper because things were just literally like folding under the impact of the water. And it was a lightning storm. And so we started making the print at World's End, and then we chased our way ahead of the edge of the storm out further onto Cape Cod, where we finished printing. I loved the fact that the piece in the show kind of collapsed this time and weather that were happening out in the environment. And I love the fact that it speaks to how much chance has to do with my work. Like, there's no way I could have assumed that there would be a storm when I planned that printing trip months in advance. But what I did was I adapted to the conditions around me, and I find that both exciting and necessary in my practice. I love the way weather and changes in the environment shift the way I'm working. The second piece that's in the show is a chronograph. Chronographs are exhibition-specific books, and each day of the exhibition has a page in the book. And the pages are hand-coded with cyanotype chemistry, but they are unexposed. And what happens is each day, the institution turns the page of the book and therefore initiates an exposure. So by the end of the show, these books become this kind of cumulative living record, always responding to the sunlight, the weather, the humidity that they experience during the show, and then those same factors after the exhibition.
Hideo, I'm curious about the role of chance in your work.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, just speaking about working with clay, I think people have very different ideas about how they approach a material like clay. I am someone who, I don't generally sketch work before I sit down to make something. I mean, I have a general process sketch of kind of I'm going to do something like this and then do something like that. But ideally, I like to be surprised by the things that I make, kind of when they seem like they're done. And so the most, I guess, to addressing the topic of chance, I've made a body of work recently where what I'll do is sit down at the potter's wheel and center a lump of clay and then just start making parts, a little bit at random, but, the kinds of parts that I'll often make. And then I'll have a rule for myself that after I'm done with that, I have to reassemble all of those parts into some sort of a coherent whole. But doing that while the clay is still soft, there are a lot of constraints. Like you have to put things together in a certain way so that they don't collapse under their own weight, or that the piece doesn't fall over. And it's sort of your random choices about how you put the first few pieces in will then dictate a lot about what happened, like what you can and can't do with the subsequent pieces. And so it's sort of, there's definitely a serendipity built into that approach, but constrained in a way by gravity and the kind of material affordances of clay. So I often do like to play with that interaction of, maybe me as a maker making choices in the moment, but there are often choices that are not dictating the form, but rather responding to what the material can or can't do. With a little bit of prejudice, about kind of how the direction that I want the form to go in. But I think it's similarly, it's trying to make things in a way that's more responsive as opposed to imposing a form.
Hideo, when you speak about clay, it feels very resonant to how I think about the elements that I collaborate with. And I think I think a word that both of us have used is this kind of agency in the other contributors to our practice, which feels very important with both of our work, that we are shaping an experience while responding to life conditions and seeing what other elements come into play to ultimately determine the form that occurs. And I wonder, do you think about failure a lot in your practice? Do you have a sort of definition of failure for yourself? This is a term that I've played with, and an idea that I think is essential in my practice. I think failure is maybe my most important part of my practice. And I wonder if that resonates with you.
Oh yeah, totally. I think my attitude about that has been evolving recently. I definitely used to have the experience that a piece would be finished and fired, and I would kind of feel like I really didn't like it, and so I might end up kind of smashing it and returning it to a landfill. But these days I try not to think like that, largely just because. A friend of mine kind of introduced me to the idea that individual pieces don't need to be shown on their own, like they can just become components for a larger assemblage or something like that. And that, often has a redemptive sort of arc to, pieces that I really don't like on their own. Sometimes are really good parts of larger groupings. Um, but so then, so what does it mean to have failure in that process? I tend to think of it now as when I get into moments or phases where I'm not trying anything new, so kind of like if I make a run of work that are sort of not surprising to me and I don't really feel like I learned anything, in the longer arc, that's kind of the failed, it's the wasted time or something like that, because, as you were just speaking a few seconds ago, I was really thinking about how in this way of working where you're trying to be very interactive and responsive to the elements or things that you know about your materials and your process. Like what does skill mean in that context? Like what does it mean to get better at working at those kinds of things? And I think it's all about over time understanding your materials and processes better so that in spite of the fact, or maybe amplifying the fact that you are not in total control of what's going on, that your responses are very skillful, so that even working in this kind of mode of very distributed agency, you can nevertheless have your work turn out as something that feels personally expressive. And so as you describe what you do, I mean, especially this episode with at the end of the hurricane, trying to go out there and trying to figure out what to do in that moment, right? It's sort of responding gracefully and skillfully to that circumstance. That's something that requires a huge amount of skill, right? And therefore, the work that ends up coming out of that is very personally expressive of kind of what you brought to that moment, in addition to also having a lot in it about what happened with weather systems on that particular day.
I love that idea and this notion that it's the listening as the maker, what you're hearing, how you're responding, that is shaping the notion of like, did things go well, or do things need to be revisited and to go a different way? And I totally so I'm from a photography background, and in photography especially, I feel like the tendency is to make like a million pictures and then to pull out the 5 that actually like land and have staying power. And so when I think about making, I work with that same kind of like fervor. Like I'm like, I want to make a lot of pictures. And then, I have tubes and tubes of pictures that I think were not that successful. And I haven't gotten to the point where I've torn them up and put them in a landfill yet. But I have been revisiting a bunch of these, quote unquote failed prints, unsuccessful prints, and recoding them, putting them back out in more rainstorms, trying to, I think, heighten my response to them to find a way to get them where I hope they could be, where they feel useful and lasting to me.
Yeah, I have a funny habit that I like when, many people will say this, but especially working in ceramics with a process like wood firing, you don't, there's a lot of serendipity that happens even in the kiln while things are being fired in terms of what the surfaces are like when you're done. And so when you take your pieces out of the kiln after you've done the firing and everything's cooled off, there's always a moment of surprise. And I feel like you can't even really see your work at that moment because the only thing that you can really see is how it's different from what you were maybe expecting or hoping for. And so there is a process where you have to kind of just like sit with them for a while to, I like to say, like, you want to be able to see them the way that you see something that you find on a forest floor, rather than as the end point of some extended process that you've gone through to try to make something. But what's most interesting to me is I think, I'll even at that point, even weeks later, I'll end up with some pieces that I can't decide whether or not I like them. And so those are the ones that I actually keep out invisible in my office studio. Just kind of live with them for like, sometimes it goes years and I'm still not sure. But
Have that exact same thing. Like if a piece is easy for me and I understand it, I'm not going to leave it hanging on the wall. I might be excited that I made it and excited that it exists, but it's not really the piece that's teaching me. And what I'm looking for are those pieces that they're tickling something that I haven't resolved in the work. It's both intellectually stimulating and exciting. And then I think it's essential for the work too, to continue growth. And it sounds like we have a similar kind of pattern where when there are days when I'm out printing and I'll make rules for myself that the rule is that I can't repeat what I've done. So like where does that what unfolds there? And um there's sort of a welcoming of the unknown in that moment.
yeah, and scientific research can be very similar in a way too, right? Like I feel like if all of your ideas are working out, either as experiments or as mathematical proofs or whatever, you're kind of in that rut where you're being safe. And so you do, I mean, it's complicated in a way because of funding and stuff like that, but you kind of want to be in a place where half of the ideas that you try to explore end up not working out. Because I think if you're not there, then you're not pushing the envelope and you're not really learning things as fast as you could be.
Absolutely. I think the best days in the studio are the ones where I leave kind of bewildered at what has happened.
I'm kind of curious for both of you. I think, Meghann, you've talked about the way your pieces pose a question to the viewer. And I'm curious about like how both of you looking at a piece that's maybe resolved something for you, how you want a viewer to approach that with maybe a question that's still unanswered. Um, I can clarify this, sorry, but I'm just curious about both of you are talking about like answering questions for yourself with a piece, but when you're presenting a piece to the world, do you want the question to come to the viewer answered, or how do you kind of want a viewer to approach it with maybe questions that haven't been answered?
Yeah, I get really excited at the possibility of my work offering a catalyst for connection. And I'm not that interested in prescribing the kind of details of each viewer's connection. I think, to reference what Hideo said earlier, there's as many responses as there are beings out there. But I do think that bringing a piece to an audience that is tactile and has literal residue of the shoreline and is changing in response to light, just like we're changing in response to time, has this possibility of asking, like, what does it mean to be in deep connection with the environment? What does it mean to exist in the Anthropocene where we can see these ruptures and to have the inherent longing and grief that come along with the human condition and the way we are both utterly connected and trying to separate ourselves from the environment. So it's like these questions in this really complex, kind of messy, in some ways, like not perfectly articulated in linguistic form questions. And there needs to be a kind of a rumination or a meditation space that can come from engaging with visual content.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a similar notion that I never like to try to talk about what an artwork means. I'm much more interested in talking about what an artwork does. Because so the artwork's not there to tell you something. It's there to provoke you to respond to it. And I think, nevertheless, there are more compelling things that people make, and there are less compelling things that people make, and the richness is there. That's there somehow. Some artworks, some things, just they invite a sort of metaphorical response, and they're not going to tell you what that metaphor is. They just somehow invite you to put your own contents into that bowl, so to speak. Yeah. So I think artworks or things in general, something that makes them special, something that makes them less linguistic and more like nature, is that you never exhaust the possibilities of what they can mean in a given moment. Like I think your favorite artworks, you come back to them in different moments and in different contexts, and you find something new in them. So ideally, it's sort of just like a question generator.
I love that. And I love the idea too that we're touching on of sort of beyond linguistic or non-linguistic. And what it brings up for me is that a lot of these experiences that I think art is tapping into, that they are both terrifying and beautiful. They are both full of hope and despair. And that these things that seem disparate are actually quite intertwined in most of human experience. And art can kind of let that like cognitive dissonance have a place to kind of sort itself out, even if that's just on a visual or visceral or emotional level. I do think there's something essential that happens with these like supposed dichotomies that are actually inherently intertwined.
Returning to the linguistic, though, scientific language obviously has a great importance for you, Hideo, as a professional, and also just in the way you approach the world, and Meghann in your work as well. And for both of you, writing forms a key part of your practice. I'm curious about how writing dialogues with your art, how language holds and can't hold these complex dissonances both of you are getting at.
I'll jump in. So I love to borrow titles from scientific language. Earlier, maybe 20 years ago or so, I became really fixated with early scientific imagery. There was a beautiful exhibition at SF MoMA called Brought to Light, and it showed our earliest images of comets. It showed our earliest images of X-rays, earliest images of cells inside the body. And when I was researching this imagery, I was thinking, like, how cool is it that photography has the capacity to show us what we can't see with the naked eye, and that science has the capacity, yes, of course, to teach us things, but also to speak to how little we know in this vast mystery in which we exist. And I love that the scientific images for me always pointed to like how much more curiosity, how much more investigation there is to be done in the world. My first series of cyanotypes was called literal drift, and that is a geologic term describing sand and sediment moving along a shoreline, and it's typically moved by wind and waves. So this language of literal drift became sort of also a descriptor for what was happening in my pictures. And then my pictures are impermanent, they're dynamic intentionally. And so I loved the idea that the language was active. It was describing a scientific process that we could observe. We could see shorelines changing. It's radically beyond our control. It's happening both on a human and geologic time scale. And then also the word the words literal drift could also be interpreted in this sort of playful way as literal, literal, like actual change. So I love this kind of play on the scientific language and kind of getting a little double entendre with it. Another word that I pulled from geologic language is ecotone, and an ecotone describes the meeting of two distinct environments. But what's interesting about that is just really pointing to the human desire to delineate and describe and understand, because in reality, the globe is a series of like subtle continuous changes. It's not as though there's mountains and then prairies, there's foothills in between. And so I chose that word to speak to both the non-human and human understandings of like the surface of the planet, and what does it mean when we try to chop them up and divvy them up in order to arrive at some sort of tidy, neat human conclusions, when that's not really the system that we're working with.
Yeah, for me, I think growing up within the institution of physical science anyway, language, scientific language is, it's interesting. In the physical sciences, especially working on more fundamental sorts of topics, often at the end of the day, we have recourse to mathematical models. Like, if there's ever an argument among physicists, usually we can settle those just by kind of going back to the math, which is, in a sense linguistic, but in another sense not. It's something underneath or to the side of language. I don't know. But I'm always very interested in the way that we then talk about our understanding of the math or our intuitions about the math, because I think those, how do we draw concepts out of mathematics? And, the concepts, I think, are often very linguistically based or linguistic in nature. And so I and another scientist might be talking about exactly the same mathematical model, but we'll speak about it using very different words, very different ideas. And, those different perspectives or intuitions are different because they'll bias us to explore in different directions when we're trying to understand or extend or find something new. So, there is something very interesting about the role that language plays as a kind of tool in constraining and guiding intuition in the kind of in the game of scientific research. But, on the flip side, if I try to bring those questions into the studio, I'm really interested these days in the whole idea or the notion of embodied knowledge, in terms of things that you can do, things that you can perform with your hands and eyes, that and some material that you just can't really explain to somebody else how to do. Like, clay is full of those things. Just centering clay on a wheel, eventually you get to where you do it without even really thinking about it. But then when people ask you for tips, it can be very hard to relate what you know how to do with your body to something that you could explain in language. And that's so different than the kind of understanding or knowledge that that one has as a physicist. I'm very interested in how those different things relate. And certainly, trying to understand how those two things are related to each other and complementary to each other, I think there's a lot there. I mean, I get that's as Meghann was speaking about literal drift, I think there's something there in terms of the very visceral and embodied way that you can understand that you would experience those processes if you're just sort of there on the beach over a long stretch of time, versus the name that you give it, right? Or the kind of the way that you abstract a description of what the process is, and which is necessary in some. It's necessary in some way for a kind of empirical science sort of understanding of those processes that could help you to then get to the point of being able to predict them or understand what are the most effective ways to intervene in those sorts of things if that's what we decide we need to do. But it's, understanding those terms and the logical structures around them, that's so different than actually being there, right, and having a direct experience of them and feeling them in that way. And so somehow, that a lot of what I think both of us are talking about is ways of restoring the connection between those two things.
Based on, going back to the idea of chance and language, how do both of you understand the idea of experiment and experimentation, and also what it means to play and how it fits into that?
Yeah, so my education in arts is largely founded in photography. I was a drawer before I was a photography major, but something that I loved about photography was the wet darkroom, the sort of alchemical way that the processes can create these somewhat predictable, but also like magical results. And part of what happened in my education is I had mentors express to me, you need to do it all wrong. Once you feel like you have learned everything that this one tool is possible of doing, now try it like 10 different ways that you couldn't even imagine what a possible result might be. It's just an act of experimentation. It's an act of engaging in chance. And I used to think of this kind of shift in how I was using materials as like being irreverent, like I was using materials the wrong way. And I did get some feedback about that from my field, from people who are very rigid in how they see, for example, cyanotype used. But what happened in flipping everything on its head was that I began to loosen my control over the idea of outcome and to really let what was coming from the work. And I think this references Hideo's comment about embodied knowledge, like to trust that this thing that I was trying, this thing that I had a gut reaction to try, to trust that if my arm reached for the paper in this way and put it in this tray, maybe I just go forward with that action and don't kind of edit myself or intellectualize it or make it academic. Maybe I just play and get experimental in that way, just trying things without a prescribed outcome.
Yeah, I think one of the difficulties with experiments in the scientific enterprise is that, a social difficulty is that experiments can be really expensive, right? And so, there is a notion of accountability, which absolutely should be there, but, kind of tends to dominate the way that we think about experiments in contemporary science. So, what's considered sort of the right rigorous thing to do is to plan out an experiment, which may take, several person years to actually bring together and cost a lot of money. And so, in order for that not to be considered a waste, right, or a potential waste, you're supposed to try to design your experiment so that no matter what the result of the experiment is, as long as it's properly executed, you're going to learn something that's interesting to your whole community, right? And absolutely, there are a lot of reasons why it should be that way. But if you pull back to kind of a meta level, what you realize about that is the experiment then gets treated in a very transactional way. Right, it's this unitary thing that happens, and we ask about the value of that experiment kind of in its own outcome. But putting it in the broader context of the kind of thing that Meghann's talking about, or just what does experimentation mean as a maker, as an artist? I always think of that as over the long course of your years in the studio, you are developing this relationship with materials and process and getting to know them better. And so there, the goal over the long run is it's refining your intuition about these materials and processes. And the point of experimentation then is to provide opportunities for you to discover new things or just evolve the way that or deepen the way, this kind of intuition that you have. And even in the scientific context, I think you can think about that in exactly the same way. That we can do experiments or we can do mathematical derivations and think of them primarily as, well, it's just a kind of play that I engage in to give myself an opportunity to discover new things or develop new intuitions. And so, but for that, you really had to think about them not as these, unitary isolated transactions, but pieces of a longer game, right? And so it's because in science those things are so expensive, one has to be, you have to be moderate about it, maybe in sort of like try to do things in a way such that you're accomplishing both kinds of goals. But it is something where I think if you're trained just as a scientist in the laboratory, you develop a certain kind of attitude about experiments where, if you propose to do something where you're really not sure what will happen and you can't really say what the conclusions will be of your experiment. People will say, they'll accuse you of, oh, this is just a fishing expedition. We don't know that anything's going to come out of it. And so, that is a dominant paradigm, I think, in thinking about experimentation, where maybe, especially as we start to get concerned and interested about these very complicated things like, the global ecosystem, maybe in the long run, just trying to do things in such a way that we are attending to this long-term development of intuition in a scientific community, maybe we need to have a little bit more of an artist perspective in the way that we make value judgments about experiments in play.
I was just thinking about the analogy of a fishing expedition, and like people need to eat. And so going fishing can be quite essential. And this kind of value judgment about when we think experimentation or research or information is useful and when we deem it a waste of resources. And I remember being a young painter, and I was like not a very good painter. And my teacher held up my palette to show everyone in the class. And I was like, I am the star student. Like, this person thinks my palette is the best palette in the class. And what this professor said to a classroom full of people, and he didn't like shame me, but I remember it quite well, was she's being way too conservative with the materials. There's not enough play going on here. The concern is with preserving the amount of paint, not with finding the color that is really speaking to what she's trying to do. And it's this difficult thing when we think about eco-materialism, right? Because we don't want to just be like huge producers of waste in our studio or in our lives, and yet we are systemically implicated in a world that does generate a lot of waste, especially in our country. And so it's something that I struggle with in my own artistic practice. Like, when is it valuable enough to try using these materials? When, I just wonder if those questions exist for you also, like sort of through the eco-materialism lens, or if it's relevant for you at all.
Yeah, it prompts me back to thinking about how, even, at least in my little subfield of physics and in optical and atomic physics, there's so many examples of really, really major breakthroughs that were made by accident. Sort of in the way that somebody was doing an experiment that was aiming at XYZ, but, along the way, something unexpected happened, and somebody had the wherewithal to realize that this was an important deviation, right? That this was not a failure of the experimental plan. It was the stumbling across something really actually much more interesting than what the original goal of the experiment was. So, I mean, I do think that somewhere in there, this question of what's waste, right? Or, what is valuable expenditure. I think it does come back to the timescale over which you view things, right? Are you going to have a transactional view of like, today I have this much paint, at the end of the day I have this much paint, and what did I accomplish today, right? If it's, if there is a way to have a kind of reasoned or responsible kind of approach to the idea that sometimes materials or resources are expended with just the long-term aim of helping individual people or teams of people or communities of practice and research. The expenditure is there for the evolution of how that community understands things. Even if there's not a concise, result that you can point to in that moment, but you can just say that that process of play is one that's just necessary in the long run. Maybe, yeah, I mean, sort of advancing our sense of values around that kind of thing is maybe where we need to go.
I love that. And that feels really relevant to some of the Waters of the Americas work. One of the places where I decided to print in that series was in the waters most impacted by Kodak's production of photographic materials. So we can look at photography as a medium and say it's arguably been absolutely essential in social movements, in preserving huge swaths of public land, et cetera. And Kodak made 4 Superfund sites between New York and New Jersey. And I am a maker of photographic images, and I have used a lot of Kodak materials. And I think that sort of zooming back and thinking of big picture time, I think I'm echoing that with stepping back and looking at the ways that we're expressing the materials that we're using, the inherent impact in our making, and what kind of bigger, more pressing issues or questions can these things bring about rather than just trying to overly simplify it and saying, well, photography bad because it harms the environment. Well, photography also protects the environment, right? It's both. And so I love this messy place of living with that duality.
I'm curious for both of you, Hideo, as a viewer, consumer of photography as art, and Meghann as a practicer of it, what unique role you see photography having in addressing these complex ideas that other forms of art can't or do in different ways.
I mean, there's photography and there's photography, right? I mean, I guess if I think about conventional forms of photography, uh, if I ask myself what's really being expressed, in a way, I mean, there's a very reductive sense in which you could say that no photograph taken in a conventional manner is showing you anything that you couldn't have seen yourself if you were just there. But I think the creative content of it is so much about the perspective and the exposure, the composition and things like that, where you are the photographer is trying to help you notice or attend to things that you really easily otherwise could have missed or just never known about. So I think in the context of the broader discussion that we're having today, I see how those about how that kind of very intentional showing, right, is really important to the overall conversation about the Anthropocene and sustainability. When it comes to Megan's work, though, it's really I think of those in a related but very different kind of way. That they really are records of process, right, or records of interaction. Where earlier when Meghann was describing just to us kind of the way that some of these pieces are made, I really heard it as so Meghann prepares a sensitized material, and the material has kind of an experience in the landscape, in the environment for a while. And then that comes back as a record of all of that. And so I think, the things, the objects that get made are really a testament to the way in which it's possible, as we both were talking about earlier in the podcast, to work with nature, to work with natural processes and materials in this way, where there is this kind of synergy of human beings, personal expressive intent, but then also not imposing upon nature, but really kind of working with it. Which, maybe once upon a time that was the only way that we could do anything, right, in a pre-technological era. But I think it's really great, in this day and age to emphasize a way of making things, a way of making art that revalues that sort of approach, where you're not using technology to kind of dominate or dictate sort of what the final thing is, but you're sort of letting go of that technological crutch or scaffold to kind of go back to a place where you're relying on a bit of serendipity and the affordances of nature to make anything.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that really excited me when I first started this work was the the fact that I could make pictures with the landscape, sort of the landscape that were not mediated by a lens. It was just physical connection. Photographic material touches water. Photographic material touches sand. And for me, that process of working so intimately and deliberately in direct contact has unpacked a sensitivity to the natural world that I feel really grateful to be tapped into. And it's kind of become like a positive feedback loop with the work, where the more I do it, the more I do it.
Yeah, I was just thinking. I mean, there's a philosopher that I really like to teach with in courses that touch upon art is Nelson Goodman, who wrote a book called Languages of Art, and he's actually developing a very analytic perspective on what expression means. But he says something very interesting about how, in order to express something, a work of art needs to actually be a sample of it. And so, if you think about just the like conventional digital photography, yeah, the image that you're being shown is a sample of a visual field or something like that. But these objects that Megan's making, they're a sample of that interactivity of materials and environment and chemistry, right? Natural chemistry, in a way that really the thing that is created really is a sample of that kind of entangled web of interactions and what can come out of it that can be these beautiful objects.
Speaking of the chemistry, I think we have a shared relationship with iron.
Oh, that's great.
So most, light photographic materials, they have typically a heavy metal that is light sensitive, so silver, platinum, etc. But with cyanotype, it's just iron. And I was listening to you speak on another podcast about the surprises that come from the iron that's in the clay. And I had this kind of like, oh, we're like iron soul twins or something. Because with the cyanotype, iron will do really interesting things with different kinds of mercurial waters, and it will show up as rust, and it will slowly show up over time. And I love this idea that there's this latent metal just hanging out in your work and in my work, waiting for an opportunity to express through heat or moisture or whatever conditions, kind of put it in a pressure chamber and create a visual form.
Yeah, no, iron's amazing that way. We recently had a talk here by the artist Amanda Williams, who was talking about Prussian blue, and about how there are. We should fact check this, but I believe what Amanda said was that it was George Washington Carver who had patented a process for making a kind of Prussian blue where the iron actually just comes from red clay in the soil. So there's a clay cyanotype connection there for sure. Um, but yeah, I generally working in ceramics, many people create beautiful work using glazes that have chrome, copper, all these other kinds of metals in them. I always kind of feel like, I mean, why not work with non-toxic materials like iron in its various chemical states and compounds can give you kind of almost any color. And I do love this idea that rather than dictating what the colors are, you just let them kind of emerge through this process of wood firing, or other things like that. So yeah, I feel like it's a little bit more, it's the art that nature wants you to make in a sense, right? To use these sorts of natural materials that are not the super rare ones, but actually, some of the most abundant elements that you can find.
And not like a huge problem of disposal, right? When
No,
you're done with it, there's not the issue of we have to capture the silver and take it to a special refinery. It's like the iron exists everywhere. I'm curious if you've ever heard people talk about Prussian blue used in remediation from radioactivity.
I have not, but it wouldn't surprise me. And I feel like iron compounds often show up in filtering applications, but you know something about it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, totally. So, I had the honor of going on a trip to the Marshall Islands a couple years ago, and there were about 30 of us, artists, writers, thinkers, about half from the Marshall Islands and then half from international locations. And what we were doing was looking at essentially the heart of the Anthropocene. The United States, bombed the Marshall Islands 67 times after World War II and created a massive crisis in their ecosystem and with their beings, human and non. And now they're sort of the ground zero for sea level rise. The average sea level in the Marshall Islands is like 6 inches above sea level. And so an inch here or there has a huge impact. And I think that the reason that I got invited on that trip was because I had proposed to make cyanotypes there. And one of the researchers who led it and I went down this rabbit hole of reading about how Prussian blue capsules were given to animals after Chernobyl
Oh
to
wow.
actually extract some of the radioactive issues from their body. And so I also began then to think about the capacity for my prints to be a microscopic remediation. I mean, I'm not trying to be grandiose here. I know how teeny that is, but the thought of the artwork becoming a gesture of also repair in the landscape feels like a possibility that we need more in the Anthropocene than ever. So I'm not sure what it's called. It is a piece. Well, the documentation is you standing next to what appears to be a fallen old growth tree, and there is a suspended ceramic vessel held by ropes that both appear to be holding it up and possibly pulling it apart. And then there are these kind of anchor rocks down below the ceramic vessel. And when I looked at this piece of yours, I don't know, it was like, oh, I totally get him. It felt so revelatory in its push and pull and in the richness of like, is that vessel going to withstand this weight and this pressure? And it felt like also like a diagram for expressing a scientific theory. And I just wonder if you want to talk about that piece at all.
Oh, sure. No, thanks for bringing it up. It is, I don't often feel like there are intersections between the ways that I think as a physicist and sort of the stuff that I make. But that was an example of an outdoor site-specific installation piece up at Gerasi, at the Gerasi Artist Residency. And so, yeah, there is this place where a large redwood had fallen across Harrington Creek, which the creek bed is pretty deep there. But I was there during the summer where when the water level was pretty low, and I just had on my mind things about gravity and water. Among other things, when you're a resident there, you have the opportunity to propose to install an artwork anywhere on the grounds. But they were at the point where they were kind of like, we really prefer that you not add yet another piece to that area around Harrington Creek because so many people put their work there. And it took a little while to understand why that was such a popular place. But it's really kind of like, gravity brought water down on that particular path. The water there made it a place where trees really grew. The trees provide shade, and the shade made it a pleasant place to work, compared to some of the other places on the Gerasi grounds. So there was some agency of gravity and water that I somehow wanted to try to commemorate. And the piece that's hanging there off the tree, that's made from clay, just harvested from the grounds. Like when you walk from the artist barn to the artist house, there is all of this clay on the path. And it's actually being dug up constantly by the critters that live there. They're just these little like mounds of clay outside their burrows. So you can just kind of go scoop that up and clean it up a little bit and make pots out of it. But yeah, there are those ropes that are anchored in the fallen tree. But then what I tried to do is kind of take the heaviest rocks that I could carry on my own and just tie netting, like use the rope to make nets to tie around them so that those heavy rocks are really anchoring each of those two vertical rope lines. And if you think about it, like if there's enough weight really pulling down on those ropes, it's kind of like they're kind of these like fixed railings, right? They can support weight even laterally. So the piece that hangs in the middle, it doesn't sag down and bring the two ropes together because those rocks are so heavy, right? Like pulling the lines absolutely taut. But a decision that I decided to make was, you could see on the creek bed where the high water line was. And so I did make those two side ropes long enough that the rocks are down. They were above the level of the water at that time, but they were below the high water mark for the creek bed. So the idea of the way that it's all suspended was eventually there was going to be enough rain that the creek was going to be running fast. Those two rocks would really get dragged around and they would kind of rip the piece apart. And it would sort of go back to just, all those sherds would just sort of fall into the riverbed. And that did, I have one great photo that somebody took for me at a time when I wasn't there, when the creek was high enough that you could see those rocks kind of getting dragged around. I think the piece survived that. But since then, in another rainy season, it apparently all broke apart. So that piece is actually gone now. But that was the intention of it at the beginning.
Gosh, I love that. I love that exploration. I love the tension that's in the piece and in how the piece functions. I love the reliability on time and water in that piece. I mean, you can see why that really touches me. But I'm so glad we talked about it because when I looked at it, of course, I had my own response to feeling like a connection with you, maker to maker. But then I also felt like it had a way of expressing like complicated truths like physics, for example, in a really beautiful and elegant and like accessible way. Like people could look at this and understand that there was tension involved and there was pressure and force and whatnot. So it was just very satisfying to spend some time with that piece. Yeah.
Oh, that's so kind of you to say. It was one thing about it was it's down in the creek bed that you had to do a little bit of work to get down there. So I think most people were looking at it from pretty far above, and so maybe you wouldn't appreciate those things. But no, thanks very much for bringing it up. Yeah, it felt like a very personal thing at the time, and actually, in that way, maybe it was okay for it to be a little bit hidden, and okay for it to be not super permanent. But I can see how. I think I see how that would have connected to sort of your spirit as a maker, where it really was just sort of you're just sort of setting a process in motion. that is not aimed at being archivally permanent. That's sort of not the point, but you're just sort of like bringing things together for a time and then sort of setting them loose to do whatever it is that they're going to do.
Absolutely. And I think there's so much pressure around artwork to be archival, to be lasting. And I always come back to the question of why would we expect artwork to escape impermanence? Impermanence impacts everything. So let's let artwork play with that and acknowledge that and find the beauty in that difficulty of time.
Yeah, and so while it is around, you have to appreciate it that much more, right?
That's right.
Beautiful. I love how it's kind of an archive of your labor as well, like that piece.
Yeah, those rocks are heavy. I don't think I could do that anymore. My back wouldn't take it.
Yeah, and I guess I'm curious, kind of thinking through these ideas of experimentation and outcomes that are uncertain. The Anthropocene is one where science is gradually narrowing the outcomes that we know are going to happen, as in the possibilities and the estimates for, say, global warming are narrowing. How do you think about making art with the environment, knowing these outcomes, knowing what's not known and what's known?
I'm not a specialist in environmental sciences by any stretch of the imagination, but my impression just from reading about how things are going, in modern Western technology and engineering and natural science, I think we've gotten so used to the idea that as science advances, so does our capability to solve more and more complicated and pressing problems. But I think when it comes to something like what's happening to the planet, it's such a complicated thing where actually a majority maybe of the factors are not nature factors, right? They're not physics or biology factors. They're behavioral factors, and they have to do with different people's, different species, different communities' ideas of what progress means, or where they want things to go. In the face of that, I had to feel like maybe one has to acknowledge that. Climate change and all these things, these are not problems that can be solved, right? There are many different ways that we can move forward, and kind of a lot of what we need scientific understanding for is just to try to figure out how to respond to what's happening in a way that we're not going to regret later, right? It comes back to a little bit of this idea that the skill is not necessarily in controlling, but the skill is in responding gracefully to achieve outcomes that you feel good about. But yeah, so a lot of what has to happen, there's a huge role for art in terms of just helping people process this huge change in perspective about kind of the fate of humanity and civilization on planet Earth. And again, kind of as we were discussing at the very beginning, just trying to help more people sort of feel the urgency of the situation and feel a need to respond in some way.
I think areas where we put our attention tend to demonstrate things that we care about. And so the more we can put attention in our art making, in our writing, etc., toward these big environmental questions, the more minds we can attract to thinking about these problems. And as you said, ways to respond to these real-time conditions. Something that stays with me over time is a dear, dear friend of mine who I called right at the beginning of the pandemic. And I was like, I don't know how to make art in this. I don't know what to do with this difficult moment. And all he said very calmly was, in times of crisis, the world needs art more than ever. And I've just tried to let that be with me. Just trust that there's some way that this work is responsive and essential, or else I don't think I'd feel so compelled to spend my whole life doing it.
Thank you both so much for your time. It's been a privilege to hear you two in conversation.